A man walks alone through a barren field. The scorching sun punishes his skin as he gazes toward the horizon. His thoughts are troubled, his breathing heavy. In just a few moments he will make a decision that will cost him his life. His name is Onan, son of Judah, grandson of the patriarch Jacob. His act, so grave in God's eyes, remained for centuries as one of the most mysterious and misunderstood episodes in the Holy Scriptures. Hidden within the pages of Genesis, among stories of great deeds and divine miracles, lies a brief narrative about a man whom God struck down, not for murder, not for idolatry, but for something that many modern readers completely misunderstand or interpret incorrectly. What could be so serious that it led the Creator to take Onan's life so suddenly? What transgression exceeded the limits of divine patience? And why does this story remain shrouded in such silence, rarely mentioned from pulpits or in Sunday school lessons? The truth behind this episode reveals not just an act of disobedience, but a profound conflict between personal ambition and family responsibility. A story that exposes the roots of values about inheritance, lineage, and commitment that would form the foundation of Israelite society for generations. This narrative brings a perspective on family loyalty that few know, but which profoundly influenced the development of marriage and inheritance laws in biblical times. Onan's case isn't simply about a man who died for his sin. It's about the fundamental principles that sustained an entire civilization. To truly understand what happened in that distant field, we need to travel back in time. We need to comprehend the world in which Onan lived, the expectations that weighed on his shoulders, and the moral crossroads he faced. We need to unravel the almost forgotten customs that gave structure to society in those times. Some Bible stories are clear in their lesson. Others remain enigmatic for centuries, waiting for attentive eyes to uncover their secrets. Onan's story belongs to this second category, a brief narrative, but loaded with deep meanings about character, commitment, and the consequences of our most intimate choices. What you're about to discover isn't just the tragic story of a man who lost his life for disobeying God. It's a glimpse into the values and practices that shaped the identity of the people who would eventually receive the tablets of the law. It's a window into a distant world where the survival of a family lineage took precedence over individual desires. When the pages of history open, you'll see that Onan's sin was far more complex than many imagine, and the divine punishment, far from being arbitrary, was intrinsically linked to the importance of that moment in God's great plan for the formation of his chosen people. Onan's world was radically different from ours. Imagine a time without banks, without social security systems, without nursing homes. A time when the only guarantee of survival in old age was having children who would care for you. A time when the continuity of your name and your memory depended entirely on the existence of heirs. We're in the land of Canaan, approximately 1700 BC. The great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia dominated the known world, while small clans and nomadic families traversed the territories between these empires, seeking pastures for their flocks and safe places to establish temporary camps. The family of Judah, Onan's father, had recently separated from Jacob's other sons. While his brothers remained together, Judah chose to move away and build his own life among the Canaanites. It was there that he met and married the daughter of a man named Shua, a Canaanite woman. From this marriage, 3 sons were born, a firstborn, Onan the second, and Shua the youngest. Each of these boys grew up knowing that their value and position in society would be determined by their ability to produce descendants and preserve the family lineage. The landscape around them was of rolling hills, open fields where they pastured sheep and goats, and small settlements where merchants exchanged goods. The intensely blue sky during the day transformed into a spectacle of stars at night, serving as a constant reminder of the promise God had made to Abraham, their great-grandfather, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. Animal skin tents were their homes, the sounds of the flocks, the soundtrack of their lives. The rhythm of their days was marked by sunrise and sunset. There was no electricity, no technology, just knowledge passed from generation to generation about how to survive in that often hostile environment. In this society, Death was a constant companion. Diseases that we consider simple today regularly claimed lives. Life expectancy was short. Therefore, having children early was not only desirable but necessary for clan survival. When Onan's older brother reached adulthood, Judah found him a wife named Tamar. It was customary for the father to choose wives for his sons, seeking advantageous alliances with other families or clans. Marriage wasn't seen as a romantic union, but as a social and economic contract. Tamar's main function as heir's wife was to bear children who would continue Judah's lineage. Especially important would be the first male child, who would inherit the position of firstborn, with all the rights and responsibilities associated with this title. He would receive the largest portion of the inheritance and assume family leadership after his father's death. But something unexpected happened. The firstborn acted so wickedly in God's eyes that the Lord took his life. The scriptures don't specify what sin committed, only mentioning that his actions deeply displeased God. With death, Tamar found herself in an extremely vulnerable situation. She was a childless widow in a society where women depended entirely on men for survival. Without a son to secure her position in the family, she could be sent back to her father's house, losing any right to protection and support from her deceased husband's family. It was at this critical moment that an ancient custom came into play, known as the livirate law. This practice, common in various cultures of the ancient Middle East, stipulated that when a man died without leaving descendants, his brother had the duty to marry the widow and have children with her. The first child born of this union would be legally considered the deceased brother's son, thus ensuring the continuity of his lineage and the social protection of the widow. This tradition wasn't just a social custom, but contained deep spiritual and practical significance. In the mindset of that time, a man only continued to live through his descendants. Dying without children was considered an absolute tragedy, as it meant the end of his memory and participation in his tribe's future. This is how Onan, Judah's second son, suddenly found himself in a complicated position. With the death of his older brother, he was now responsible for continuing lineage, marrying Tamar, and producing children who legally wouldn't be his, but his deceased brother's. It's important to understand that this arrangement had serious implications for Onan. If had no descendants, Onan would become the de facto firstborn, entitled to the double portion of the inheritance that normally belonged to the first son. But if he fulfilled his duty and produced a son with Tamar, that son would be legally considered son, and it would be him, not Onan, who would inherit the privileged position of firstborn. Onan therefore found himself facing a moral and economic dilemma. Fulfilling his family and religious duty would mean giving up significant material benefits. Disobeying would be a serious transgression against the fundamental values of his society, and more importantly, against divine will. It was in this context of conflict between duty and ambition, between the collective good of the family and individual interest, that Onan's brief and tragic story unfolded. A story that in just a few verses reveals the profound moral and social tensions that permeated life in the ancient world. Judah didn't delay in acting after death. As the family patriarch, it was his responsibility to ensure the continuity of the lineage and Tamar's protection. Following established custom, he called Onan and gave him a clear order: sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. Judah's words weren't just a request. They were a command clothed in patriarchal authority and founded on traditions considered sacred. For Onan, openly refusing would be an unthinkable act of defiance against his father and against the customs that governed his society. Externally, Onan obeyed. He agreed to marry Tamar, as traditions required. The wedding was performed following the usual rites. Tamar, who was probably still mourning now had a new husband. For all intents and purposes, the family duty was being fulfilled. But in the secret of the nuptial chamber, away from the community's eyes, the story was different. Onan knew perfectly well what his obligation was: to sleep with Tamar and produce a son who would be legally considered son. a son who would inherit the position of firstborn and most of Judah's property. When alone with Tamar, Onan deliberately frustrated the main purpose of that marriage. The biblical text is clear in its description, but Onan knew that the child would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. This act, known as coitus interruptus, wasn't just a matter of personal preference or contraceptive method. It was a calculated rejection of the sacred duty entrusted to him. Each time Onan deliberately prevented conception, he was effectively denying his deceased brother the right to continue his lineage. Tamar's situation became increasingly distressing. For a woman in that society, having children wasn't just a personal fulfillment, but a necessity for social and economic survival. Without children, especially male children, she would remain in an extremely vulnerable position, a widow dependent on the charity of her husband's family, with no active voice in decisions affecting her own life. Day after day, month after month, Tamar's belly remained unchanged. In the community, looks of pity and whispers began to multiply. Why hadn't the young widow conceived yet? Was she barren? Was Judah's family under some curse? For Tamar, the situation was doubly painful. Not only did she suffer from the absence of motherhood so valued in her culture, but she also carried the social stigma of a woman apparently unable to bear descendants. And worst of all, she knew exactly why she couldn't get pregnant, but she couldn't publicly denounce Onan's actions without causing a family scandal. Meanwhile, Onan continued his life normally. In the community's eyes, he was fulfilling his duty. No one suspected that, behind the facade of compliance, he was deliberately sabotaging the fundamental purpose of his marriage to Tamar. His motives were clear. With Urs dead without descendants, Onan was now in the position of de facto firstborn. If there was no son of Urs to claim the inheritance, it would be he who would receive the double portion that belonged to the first son. His calculations were cold and precise. Each time he prevented Tamar from conceiving, he protected his own material interests. However, there was something Onan didn't adequately consider. God's eyes were upon him. The same God who had judged his brother Urs for his wickedness now observed his secret actions. The biblical text doesn't mention how long this situation lasted, but it makes clear it didn't go unnoticed by divine eyes. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. The divine sentence was as sudden as it was definitive. In one moment, Onan was alive, calculating how to preserve his privileged position. The next moment, his lifeless body lay on the ground. Onan's death, like his brothers before him, sent shockwaves through Judah's family. 2 sons dead in sequence, both married to the same woman, both without leaving descendants. For many, this seemed more than coincidence. Suspicions about Tamar began to arise. Was there something about her that attracted divine wrath upon her husbands? Judah, devastated by the loss of 2 sons, now faced a new dilemma. According to custom, his third son, Shelah, should assume the same role as Onan, marry Tamar and try to produce an heir for Urs. But fear had settled in the patriarch's heart. What if Shelah died too? What if there really was something wrong with Tamar? Shelah was still too young to marry. Judah argued to himself, it would be better to wait until he grew older before exposing him to the same risks that had claimed his brothers' lives. So Judah said to Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up." It was a temporary solution, a way to buy time while deciding what to do in the long term. For Tamar, however, this meant an even deeper social limbo, neither fully part of her husband's family, nor free to rebuild her life by marrying another man. Obediently, Tamar returned to her father's house. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Shelah grew up and reached marriageable age, but Judah's call never came. Slowly, Tamar began to perceive a harsh truth. Judah had no intention of giving her his youngest son. His promise had been just a way to send her away. Tamar's situation was now desperate. A widow, childless, practically abandoned by her husband's family, with increasingly diminished prospects of ever having children who would guarantee her security. Her youth was passing, and with it her chances of motherhood. It was in this moment of desperation that Tamar made a drastic decision, a decision that would completely change the course of events and reveal the true nature of the conflict that had led to Onan's death. A decision that, although morally ambiguous by modern standards, would be understood very differently in the context of justice and values of that time. What happened next in the story of Tamar and Judah is one of the most surprising and little discussed episodes in Scripture. After years of waiting for Judah to fulfill his promise to give her Shelah as a husband, Tamar received news. Judah, now a widower, was on his way to Timnah for the shearing of his sheep. Seeing this as her only opportunity, Tamar devised a bold plan. She took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise her identity, and sat at the entrance to Onan, on the road to Timnah, disguised as a cult prostitute, a common practice among the Canaanites. She waited for Judah. The plan worked perfectly. Judah, without recognizing her, approached and solicited her services. When he promised to send her a young goat from his flock as payment, Tamar cleverly asked for guarantees: Judah's seal, cord and staff, personal items that functioned as a kind of identification at the time. Judah agreed, handed over his personal belongings, and slept with her. From that single encounter, Tamar conceived. When Judah sent a friend to pay the supposed prostitute and recover his personal items, she had already disappeared. No one in the region knew of such a prostitute. 3 months later, news reached Judah's ears: Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality. Judah's reaction was immediate and severe: bring her out and let her be burned. The hypocrisy of this sentence is notable, considering his own recent actions. It was at this critical moment that Tamar revealed her masterstroke. As they were bringing her out, she sent the personal items to Judah with a message: by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. The recognition was instantaneous. The objects were unmistakably Judah's. Confronted with the evidence of his own duplicity, Judah had no choice but to admit, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. This public declaration not only saved Tamar's life, but also restored her honor and position in the family. This extraordinary twist in the story reveals an aspect frequently ignored about Onan's sin. What made his act so serious in God's eyes wasn't simply the contraceptive method itself, as many traditional interpretations suggest. It was the selfish motivation behind the act. Onan knew that any child born from his union with Tamar would be legally considered Er's son. This son would inherit the firstborn's portion that, with Er's death, would theoretically pass to Onan. By deliberately preventing conception, Onan was effectively stealing his deceased brother's right to the continuity of his lineage, and more importantly, usurping inheritance rights. This perspective sheds completely new light on the severity of the divine punishment. Onan's sin wasn't primarily sexual, but a serious violation of family and social justice. He appeared to fulfill his duty, taking advantage of the privileges of his marriage to Tamar, while secretly sabotaging the true purpose of that union. The story ends with Tamar giving birth to twins, Perez and Zerah. In a surprising development, Perez, the firstborn of this unusual union, became a direct ancestor of King David, and consequently of Jesus Christ. Perez's name appears in the genealogies, recorded in both Matthew and Luke. This detail often goes unnoticed, but it's deeply significant. From Tamar's seemingly hopeless situation, from Onan's selfish actions, and Judah's hypocrisy, God forged a crucial link in the lineage that would eventually lead to the Messiah. There's a notable irony in this. Onan refused to produce an heir for his brother, fearing to lose status and material goods. But the son that Tamar eventually conceived not with Onan or Shelah, but with Judah himself, became part of a much more important lineage than any earthly inheritance. This story contains surprisingly relevant lessons about justice, family loyalty, and the consequences of actions motivated by greed. Onan outwardly appeared to fulfill his duty, but in the privacy of his intimacy, his actions revealed his true character. To discover more fascinating stories like this, just subscribe to the channel. There are countless episodes in Scripture that, like this one, remain little explored in conventional Bible studies, but contain profound lessons about human nature and divine principles. The episode of Onan and Tamar also reveals how God frequently uses unlikely situations and people in his plans. Tamar, a marginalized woman, widow and foreigner, became a crucial instrument in the divine plan, while Onan, who had everything in his favor, lost everything because of his selfish choices. This narrative challenges simplistic interpretations. It's not a black and white story, with perfect heroes and irredeemable villains. It's a story that reflects the complexity of real life, where people make questionable choices driven by difficult circumstances, where divine justice operates in unexpected ways, and where redemption can emerge from the most unlikely places. The story also sheds light on ancient social practices that are fundamental to understanding many other biblical passages. The livirate custom central to this narrative reappears in the story of Ruth and Boaz, for example, and helps explain several laws found later in Deuteronomy. Onan's death, seen in this broader context, wasn't an arbitrary punishment for a sexual transgression, but a just consequence for violating fundamental principles of family and social responsibility, in a time when such principles were literally matters of life and death for the most vulnerable. The brief passage about Onan in Scripture remained for centuries obscured by interpretations that focused exclusively on the sexual aspect of his actions. However, when we examine the complete story, including what happened before and after, a much richer and more significant picture emerges. Onan's account isn't primarily about sexual practices or contraceptive methods. It's a story about the eternal conflict between self-interest and responsibility toward others. It's about the temptation to appear to be doing right while secretly acting from selfish motives. In an increasingly individualistic world, where family and community ties are frequently sacrificed on the altar of personal gain, Onan's story resonates with surprising relevance. How many times in our current society do we see people who outwardly fulfill their duties, but internally subvert the true purpose of their responsibilities? The justice that God demanded of Onan is the same justice that continues to be relevant today, the moral obligation to honor our commitments, not only in external form but also in internal intention. It's not enough to do what's right, it must be done for the right reasons and with the right heart. Tamar, on the other hand, represents those who, even in positions of extreme vulnerability and facing injustices, refuse to passively accept their fate. Her boldness and determination in seeking what was rightfully hers, even resorting to unconventional methods, forced Judah to confront his own hypocrisy and recognize his guilt. And in the end, the story reminds us that God's ways are greater than our mistakes and failures. From the moral confusion and injustice of this episode emerged Perez, a vital link in the lineage that would eventually produce King David, and later, Jesus Christ. Who could imagine that from the irregular union between Judah and his daughter-in-law would come an ancestor of the Messiah? Who could foresee that the one who was almost executed as an adulteress would become part of the sacred genealogy? This is God's surprising economy, transforming our human failures into opportunities for His grace. The next time you read about Onan in the Bible, remember it's not just the story of a man who died for an inappropriate sexual act.
It's the story of how God sees beyond appearances, demands integrity in all areas of life, and values justice for the vulnerable above the comfort of the privileged. The story also invites us to question in what areas of our life might we be imitating Onan. Where are we outwardly fulfilling our obligations while internally sabotaging their true purpose? Where are we putting personal gain above family or community responsibility? And perhaps more importantly, the story challenges us to consider the Tamars in our society, those who are vulnerable, marginalized, voiceless, and to ask if we are perpetuating unjust systems that keep them in that condition. In the words that Judah was finally forced to pronounce, "She is more righteous than I," this reluctant confession continues to echo through the centuries as a reminder that it is often the powerful, not the vulnerable, who need to examine their consciences and actions. Among the many lessons we can draw from this ancient narrative, perhaps the most relevant is this: God isn't concerned only with our external acts of obedience, but also with the motivations of our heart. And when those motivations involve injustice toward others, especially the most vulnerable, we cannot expect our actions to remain without consequences. In the end, Onan's story is a mirror. In it we see reflected our own tendencies towards selfishness disguised as virtue. In it we are confronted with the truth that God sees not only what we do but why we do it. And in it we find the timeless challenge to live with integrity in both our public actions and our most private moments.